And Bob, let me start with you. So, can we call China an enemy? What does this issue with the flights at this juncture tell us, especially in the wake of coronavirus and everything going on? What is going to happen with the trade deal? Where are we at in the relationship, do you think?
No, I mean, I think the flights are just one more irritant on top of irritant on top of irritant. I wouldn't call them enemies. I would say we're getting to the point where we're adversaries, though, certainly. The trade deal had created a truce in the trade war, but it was quickly overtaken by COVID, by Hong Kong, by one thing after another. I mean, we're at a point now where the two economies are disengaging from one another, not quite going to the decoupling that people talk about, but definitely disengaging.
And Lingling, it's fascinating in the early pages of the book to read about how I think it was your grandfather was marching along Chairman Mao, on the Long March. And then you wind up leaving China, becoming a U.S. citizen, giving up your passport. You still then go to Beijing as the Journal's correspondent and now have just been kicked out of the country, which I can't imagine, that means you can't be with your family, among many other losses. So what has this experience been like for you, and how does it feel for you, the relationship between these two countries?
Thank you, Kelly. Great to be on your show. Yes, for a long time, I've always looked at myself and people like me, who straddle both countries as, living examples of how the close relationship between the U.S. China can benefit individuals. I remember in early 2011, when I went to the Chinese consulate in New York, applying for journalist visa in order to go back to China and do practice independent journalism, the visa officer just looked at my application and said something like, we have never seen applications like yours, because, she was referring to my Chinese background. So anyway, there are a lot of people who are like me, because the years of engagement between these two economies, who straddle between these two countries. But by now, I have become the collateral damage for the worsening of the relationship. Many people in China call people like me today 炮灰, which means bomb ashes. So it just quite, for me personally, it's just, it's an amazing experience. I lived the history but I also, it's heartbreaking to leave China, but I also felt very fortunate in a way that, I not only lived the history, but being able to write about it, and just in this book, also just part of the reflection of what we individually have been have gone through over the past few years.
And the reporting is phenomenal. I mean, you go into Politburo meetings during the trade negotiations over the trade deal on the Chinese side, explaining some of the caution and where it came from on the U.S. side. I mean, it's really fascinating stuff. And Bob, you've also, reading about your dad and how he, was one of the patenters of a garment bag, right? I mean, here's someone who is original American manufacturing in Brooklyn. That's taken away from him. Like you said, he didn't necessarily have any bitterness about it. But what do you think the next chapter of American manufacturing looks like if we are in this disengaging from China?
Well, I think, the fundamentals of the manufacturing remain. I mean, the U.S. is a high-wage country, is going to be a high-wage country. Some of the companies in China will certainly expand their production outside of China. They were starting to do that before the trade war. It's accelerated with the trade war, accelerated again with COVID. But I wouldn't expect to see much of that come back to the U.S. Maybe things like pharmaceuticals, where we see we're particularly dependent on China for, essential materials, but there aren't that many of those kind of companies. So I think you'll see, continuation of companies expanding, not necessarily leaving China, but expanding outside of China. But I wouldn't expect to see them coming back to the U.S., and we're certainly not going to see a garment industry in Brooklyn again.
Right. So last thing, Bob, what message do you want investors to take away from reading this book? How should they be thinking through the relationship between the U.S. and China, the trade deal, and so much of the rest of that?
I think they have to just be aware that this isn't a trade war that started with Donald Trump. It's not going to be a trade war that ends with Donald Trump. We're in a long-term period of the countries disassembling from one another, derailing one another, and that's something you're just going to have to factor in. That's kind of the new reality.